Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the incredible new 2 CD release of the Live and Let Die score by George Martin by the LaLa Land Records label as part of their ongoing series of James Bond reissues that they've been doing basically whenever they get the chance to, starting with releases of the David Arnold scores for Die Another Day, The World Is Not Enough, then Tomorrow Never Dies. Now moving further into the classic era, doing scores tied to the anniversary year releases of both Live and Let Die and Octopussy. This is something we hope to see more of as both Bond fans and even the people who worked on these releases and the label themselves want to do more. It's just convincing MGM and Eon to actually authorize them to do so. Now, Live and Let Die had previously been one of the expanded scores as part of the 2003 CD soundtrack remasters done for Capitol Records by Lucas Kendall, who is one of the gurus of boutique soundtrack releases and soundtrack restorations, but he was not given very much in terms of resources to work with and did the best he could at being able to expand which soundtracks he could. Not all of them were complete, and they were done very, very quickly, again, on a very meager budget, so only certain scores got the expanded treatment and still had to be based around their original LP track program dating back to the original vinyl release. So Live and Let Die was at least thankfully expanded on the 2003 remaster, but it could basically be bettered, and now it finally has on the LaLa Land release, which basically carries the torch further and is actually linked to that 2003 release in quite a surprising way, in that it uses the exact same source transfer as the 2003 CD, which you would think would mean that it didn't sound all that much different, but then you would be dead wrong because it sounds completely different in terms of fine details and the overall mix and balance of the presentation. Now, Live and Let Die, of course, was the 8th James Bond film released in 1973 and is often, I think, unfairly labeled as just the blaxploitation Bond film, and this also gets tied into how people look at George Martin's score. It's also part of how they don't really take the Bond films seriously as art, which is of course their mistake because they are art, and I don't think it's fair to label the film as a attempt to try and cash in on the success of what is now known as the blaxploitation movement. It was merely deciding to adapt a problematic novel at a time where other films were having success in terms of being set within the black community and having more and more black actors and actresses and other people on the other side of the camera. So it was a wise move to adapt Live and Let Die at the time, but that doesn't mean that it should be simply written off as an attempt to cash in on a popular style or a subject matter of the time period. Of course, there's always some degree of that, as the Bond films of the 70s would very much follow that sort of attempting to at least match the market in a way. But I do think the film is extraordinarily underrated, and of course, I'm biased, as not only am I a lifelong Bond fan, but Live and Let Die is my favorite film of all time. So, again, I admit my bias, first and foremost. But Martin's score is, I don't think, as praised as it should be. I think it is without question the finest of the non-John Barry Bond scores, which is a distinction that has to be made because John Barry set the precedent, and starting with his From Russia with Love score primarily in 1963, and then scored so many of the films that it's impossible to escape not only his precedent and his influence, but he basically wrote the book on scoring a Bond film, but also so perfectly understood what a Bond film was and the inherent wit and cynicism that it basically became an extension of his own natural style. And they were so firmly joined that I do think it is the greatest and most notable example of one composer returning to the same subject matter over and over and over again, and merely just further refining that ability and that style. And each of Barry's scores suits the particular tone tone and approach of the film. It matches the direction beat for beat. It matches the performances, because I think the most important aspect of a Bond score, and the real secret of nailing a Bond score, is that the score takes the place essentially of the beautiful prose and descriptions that is in Ian Fleming's original novels. It takes the place of James Bond's internal monologue. So a lot of the time, the music is having to accentuate the characterization and really pick up on the energy of a given scene and the pacing, and when to not have music, because you have to study how the music is spotted and where the composers decide not to place music. And in this score, it's interesting to look at the spotting compared to the film version, because the soundtrack does have additional cues and pieces that were ultimately dropped from the film, and it's fascinating to then be able to hear this additional music on the soundtrack release and then compare the full cue versus the film version. So anyone who is not John Barry scoring a Bond film has an impossible act to follow, because you have to put your sort of own stamp on it. You have to also make sure your score fits the film, and of course you're tying into the title song, which nowadays isn't always necessarily done with the composer or the composer doing it as the main creative force. But of course George Martin had already produced the Paul McCartney and Wings title song, and that's what really got his hat in the ring in terms of being the one who was tapped to essentially compose the score, basically because he had already done the title song and they couldn't get John Barry, and it wasn't the greatest salary in the world from what I understand. And it was a brilliant choice, because since Martin had already produced the astounding title song, which is iconic in and of itself, that meant he was the perfect person to then translate that throughout an entire film underscore, and of course create additional themes and also delve further into the various fun elements of the film, whether it be the different locales, the elements of voodooism, at least some attempts to have more of a what would be then contemporary rock flavor of sorts, but also with some elements of, I would say, soul and R&B and a little bit of funk here and there, and of course having the Olympia Brass Band for the New Orleans sections. So the score does actively follow the different changes in locale in the film, which really makes them feel distinct, and it also underlines how the film has a very distinct, really like a three-act structure, just like the novel. And since the film is a chase story as well, essentially a progenitor of the one-man army type action film, the score follows that, and it knows when to match the action sequences, or when to go for suspense, or when to go for the more exotic flavors, most especially in the voodoo rituals that are depicted in the film, with Jeffrey Holder's amazing choreography for all of the dancers in those scenes. George Martin was, of course, a musical genius and a legend already as the purported fifth Beatle, and without his input, it's very doubtful the Beatles would have achieved the same level of success that they did. So his background in production and recording and composition and classical music, along with having a pop and rock sensibility, made him ideal for film composing. I think it's a shame he didn't compose more films, because all of the film scores that I've heard of his are all unique in their own way. They suit the film extraordinarily well, but I do think Live and Let Die is the standout, because it's definitely the most varied, it's the most larger than life, it's the most vibrant, and this is done to match the energy and the vibrancy of the film itself. And it's also a score that manages to not only have the action side, but also highlight elements of humor, but really get in the sensibility of trying to highlight the otherworldly, the voodoo aspects, the atmosphere of each individual scene and each individual location, and also the romance between Bond and Solitaire. The romance theme and Solitaire's theme do at least help to ground and accentuate this further. And then how Martin weaves in the various themes into the suspense and action cues when they really come in. They come in at full force, and they drive even a scene as simple as Bond and Solitaire walking up a hill, which is a shot that even starts starts out on a security camera monitor, not even the full shot at first. It just adds a sense of rising tension to a shot that's something as simple as two people walking up a grassy hill, not knowing that, of course, it's actually a secret entrance to a secret field of poppies for drug smuggling. So it is a score that manages to really highlight the factor that I think Tom Mankiewicz in his screenplay really understood about Bond so well, that some of the best experiences you can have with the character or any sort of action and adventure story is by taking what is the seemingly mundane, the everyday, the daily life items, and turning them on their head a little bit, giving them that little twist to make them feel otherworldly and suddenly exotic and larger than life. Those elements are key to the effectiveness of any James Bond story. It's something Fleming just had flowing out of his fingertips at his Royal typewriter, and the best of the films reflect this. So the film does have that sort of magical spark of having the bigger than life aspects, even though the story is much more grounded and ultimately is just about drug smuggling. And of course, when those giant action suspense cues come in, it is impossible to not get the hair standing up on the back of your neck. Just think of the chase with the double-decker bus and the bridge scene, or most of all, Trespassers Will Be Eaten, which is also probably the best executed, best edited, and best structured of all of the Snake Pit scenes in the entire James Bond series. And Martin's cue just starts small and builds the suspense until the point where it is literally unbearable, and only then, when we have the iconic crocodile walk, do we have it fully explode into fanfare. And that's an interesting moment of looking at the spotting, because in Martin's cue on the soundtrack, he actually has music over where the crocodile walk would have been, and the sort of fanfare part is a bit bigger and louder, which is not used in the film version. So that's a key moment if you're curious to look at and study how the spotting of the score was done and how the final edit was done. So there are a number of cues even on this release that, of course, reflect the original edit for the 1973 soundtrack LP, and then the film version, and of course then the full uncut cue itself. So this is a really interesting score to look at for how the cues were edited, not just for the film, but also for the original soundtrack LP release, and then getting to hear them in their entirety on a physical release is fantastic. The actual sound and recording of the score is quite excellent and befits it being a 1973 film, which of course will have better technology in terms of the recording techniques than a mono score from the earlier 60s, how John Barry started the series. And of course, they had more money to play around with. And if that wasn't enough, you of course have the genius behind the majority of the Beatles catalog, behind the mixing console, getting to do an entire film score. So I think all of those elements, and it being I believe a 16-track recording, just make the Live and Let Die score actually sound more detailed and fuller even than some of the scores that preceded it, just with the passage of time and having a production genius actually composing and then recording said score with 16-track recording and a bit more money to play around with and better technology. So if you listen to the Bond scores progressively, you'll note that really Thunderball is a bigger score, but You Only Live Twice is a step forward even over that in terms of audio fidelity and recording techniques. And then On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a step beyond that, and Diamonds Are Forever is a step beyond that, and then Live and Let Die is basically a slightly different style of recording and technique, of course, because you've got a different composer, but it also has that sort of increased fidelity in recording, and this would go on even into The Man with the Golden Gun, which is similar. And you would experience that in most any score, comparing scores from 1973 to, say, 1963. There's going to be a definite difference in audio fidelity and production and recording techniques. And also the film's final mono mix is itself quite a bit beefier in terms of the impact and the punch that I think it sounds even better than some of the mono mixes that preceded it. Again, it feels a bit fuller in terms of how it was mixed, and it's rumored, though I've never been able to nail down precisely if this is true, but it is rumored and seemingly possible that Live and Let Die was released in an alternate magnetic stereo presentation on the original release, which would be incredible and fantastic. And judging by how the mono is mixed and some other factors that I'll talk about next, it wouldn't surprise me, let's put it that way, if Live and Let Die did indeed have an alternate magnetic stereo run. Because Martin's score was also released in a very short-lived format, which was quadraphonic stereo 8-track tapes. And for whatever reason, the Live and Let Die score was only released on quadraphonic 8-track instead of also getting a quadraphonic vinyl release, which was very much in vogue at the time. But all the different formats for the consumer environment at home, basically whichever format you had and whichever record label it was would use a different form of quadraphonic decoding. So the actual implementation wasn't always the greatest, and you're also having to track down a rare and finicky to work with quadraphonic 8-track tape. But this does mean that the original recording was mixed into 4-channel quadraphonic, and it is a finished, finalized 4-channel mix of George Martin's amazing score. So if you were ever curious about was there any sort of stereo or surround implementation with any sort of James Bond materials from the classic era of the 60s and 70s, well, actually there was in a few spots, but in terms of the scores, it's really Live and Let Die having a alternate quadraphonic mix that is the one unique score presentation out there. Unfortunately, this has never been reissued, and the wonderful people behind this release did want to include it and were able to do a fresh transfer and include some of the unique materials, but couldn't get the rights clearances to do an entire additional presentation of the quad mix. And of course, the title song, which also exists in a quad mix. So I've always wanted to find a copy of that 8-track, but I don't have a player, and those tapes are extremely rare and very expensive. But thankfully, not only has it been preserved by the team behind this release, and you get some selections from it of the unique materials, but you can actually listen to an upload here on YouTube, which I'll link to. So if you listen to that YouTube upload, you can actually hear the quadraphonic mix of the album without having to go to the extreme expense of tracking down the quadraphonic 8-track release and having a compatible player that actually works, and then doing the decoding yourself because someone's already done it for you. So it's an amazing treasure to actually be able to hear the quad mix of the album, which is a really interesting mix. So it's a shame they couldn't do an official release of it on this LaLa Land release of the score, but they've actually done a new transfer of it, so at least it's now preserved, and hopefully at some point in the future it could be officially released. But at least you can hear the quad mix here on YouTube and also hear the quad mix specific elements, which they did include on the second disc of bonus material here in the LaLa Land release, just of course folded to stereo. The most notable of these is the alternate take of the title song in terms of the BJ Arnault cover version that's performed in the film in the New Orleans Filet of Soul nightclub. It's an entirely different take with a different vocal. So that one is the most notable difference that'll make any diehard fan immediately sit up and go, wait, what? So that is a major draw of the quad mix, and that is preserved here in a new transfer, albeit just in stereo on the LaLa Land release. So overall, I think George Martin's score for Live and Let Die is easily the best of the non-John Barry Bond scores. It is the most complete on its own, with its own unique identity that is following some of the core concepts that John Barry firmly established in his non-existent playbook for how to write James Bond score 101. But while there have been many remarkable non-Barry Bond scores, Martin's score is the most expansive, I think, in terms of the different amount of styles, the number of themes throughout, the accomplished recording, and the actual mix of the score itself, and the final film mix version and the mono mix and how it's spotted. It's a score that can range from some of the best action and suspense cues in the entire series to something as simple and small as the little piece of instrumental entitled San Monique that plays in different variations when Bond is on San Monique, or especially in his hotel room at the San Suchi Hotel just before the iconic Martin cue for the snake in the bathtub. So it's a score that is extraordinarily varied and thus has a certain alive quality to it that I think sets it apart even from the other outstanding non-John Barry Bond scores. So I think it's essentially the most detailed and expansive of all of the non-Barry Bond scores, and it's impossible for me to rank the scores, but it is definitely, I think, the strongest. I think the score deserves more recognition and more analysis because it's a score that manages to make Bond walking into a small gift shop, although it is the occult voodoo shop, but it manages to make Bond walking around a gift shop dramatic as all get out, and even that cue is a nice blend of oncoming suspense with a slight wink at the audience a little bit, and also underlining the harder edge of the first two Roger Moore performances in the series. It's something that Moore never gets credit for, and some describe as being an ill fit in the first two films, but the first two films are a grittier version, and they're transitional films because it took Until the Spy Who Loved Me for certain elements of the formula to be tweaked and such. But it makes the first two Roger Moore films very special, and also for being the last two of the original Eon partnership with Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. So once Harry Saltzman was gone, that was a key, essential part of the Bond formula that was no longer there. It is a truly remarkable score, and it also, rather interestingly, is the first Bond score to blend in more popular music elements and does have more of a early 70s rock edge to it. And that also gives it a unique flavor, and it is endlessly replayable. It is one of the great Bond scores you can listen to on its own, and the soundtrack has always been a great program and selection, but now we have it expanded even further with the alternates and bonus cues and a recreation of the original soundtrack program in terms of the edits on the LaLa Land release. So it really is the most comprehensive, most complete, and finest sounding version of the album to date. So now talk about the new LaLa Land release done for the film's 50th anniversary. It is rather interestingly based on the original transfers done for the 2003 CD, which were done at 24-bit 44.1 kilohertz, and you would think that this new CD would basically sound virtually identical to the 2003 CD supervised and done by Lucas Kendall. It is obviously the same score, but if you didn't know that it was the same actual transfer that was being used, the same digital files of that raw transfer, if you didn't know that, you would think that this was an entirely new transfer. That is the astonishing difference in overall presentation, mix, dynamics, and fine detail in this release. And this release was produced by Neil Bulk, and the mastering engineer was the, quite frankly, genius Chris Malone. If you don't know any of these names that I'm throwing around, they are giant names in the soundtrack community and boutique soundtracks and soundtrack restorations. But if you see, any of these names on a release, your money is well spent. But I don't know how Chris Malone did it with this, because it is, again, the same 2003 files generated for the 2003 CD. But he worked some sort of wizardry on this, because this new La La Land presentation of the score, again, from the exact same 2003 digital files, it's in a lot of areas it's like hearing some of the cues for the first time, because he was able to get out so much more fine detail, and also in his mixing strove to achieve a balance between the actual natural sound of the raw transfers and how the score was mixed for the mono track of the film, but also the 1973 stereo LP, which is very important because the stereo LP has, I've always called it more of a ballsy feel to it. It's a really nicely produced and mixed soundtrack LP for the time. It's one of the best sounding Bond soundtracks on its original vinyl release. And when you jumped over to the 2003 expanded remastered CD, it sounded great, but it lost some of that ballsiness, that sort of heft to it a little bit. It was clearer on the 2003 CD, don't get me wrong, and it had additional cues and far much more music than the soundtrack program, and also was playing around with getting some of the full uncut cues on the CD release, because several of the cues were edited specifically for the soundtrack, and those edits were even different to some of the film edits. So some of the cues have not one but two different edits for the film version and then the soundtrack version for the original LP. But what this new La La Land release really does in terms of the sound is, I think, give you some of the positives of both the original 1973 stereo LP mix of the soundtrack and the greater clarity of the 2003 expanded remaster. And it has more detail than both of them. So again, I don't know how Chris Malone did it. This is, I would describe it as pulling the audio rabbit out of the hat. It is that type of some sort of sonic sorcery, because again, this is my favorite film of all time. I've listened to this score my entire life, and there were elements that were just coming forth to my ears for in some areas seemingly the first time, or elements that seemed more buried in past releases or different mixes that were suddenly so much more clear, but nothing was ever overzealous or forced or anything like some of the bad elements you can get in, say, a gimmicky surround remix of music, which unfortunately happens in a lot of music surround mixes where they play around with the different elements too much. There's none of that. It is really like having veils lifted off of your ears when you're listening to this, because again, I don't know how he did it. I really don't, because it's the same exact files from 2003. It's just astonishing. Again, people knowing that these are the same files may think this isn't an important release to get, or they might want to get it later, or they might write it off. Please do not do that, because this is astonishingly good, especially considering it's the same exact files and transfers done in 2003 for the 2003 remastered CD, which itself was great. And this wipes the floor with that. So it's just absolutely astonishing. I expected some degree of quality increase, but knowing it was the same transfer files, I thought that would be a bit more on the limited side, and since they weren't being able to go to the original master material and do a brand new high-res transfer, I thought it would just be a slight improvement over the 2003 CD. It is the definition of improvement in all areas over the 2003 CD, which itself was already great. I want to stress that. So I know some people will think that they've got the 2003 CD and it's already expanded, and that's fine. Again, it is a great sounding release. It does not hold a candle to the new La La Land version. So just because it's coming from the same transfer files, do not let that sway you into thinking that you can just stick with the 2003 CD. I mean, of course, you obviously can, because it still sounds great, but this is such a dynamic improvement that it will make any fan of the Bond films, or this score in particular, feel like in some areas they're hearing it for the first time. And of course, you have additional score materials and the bonus features as well on the second disc, and some of the different edits of the cues, and of course the full uninterrupted cues. So it is a more complete and more stuffed release than the 2003 CD. But I'm still hanging on to that CD just for its particular mix and and mastering, and I've been listening to it for years, and I can't get rid of anything Bond related. But I'm also hanging on to the original 1973 stereo LP because, again, it is a unique mix of its own. Plus, it has the really fantastic laminated gatefold with beautiful imagery. So it does remain one of the best of the original vinyl LP soundtrack releases of the scores. The only release I don't have is the original EMI CD from about 1988 or so. Those were just basic CD digital transfers of the actual soundtrack programs. I have a few of them. They're getting harder to find these days, but they're usually sort of a warts and all presentation, and some of them don't sound all that great. So I would still like to pick it up someday just to do a full comparison with it as well. But I think it's probably going to be the least sounding of these four. And again, the LaLa Land released is just stuffed with additional materials and is the only one that is a full 2-disc CD set. So in terms of the contents of this release, again, is a 2-disc affair. Disc 1 is the full score presentation, which is just about an hour in length. This has a lot more in terms of actual cues, so it is better split than the 2003 CD, which had to cram in multiple cues onto single tracks because that was limited due to legal reasons that they had to follow the original soundtrack program. So that makes this release already easier to navigate. But we also have the various full cues and extended full cues. So this is giving you the complete score here on disc 1. Disc 2 is actually recreating the original 1973 soundtrack program. So all of the specific cues and cue edits here on the original soundtrack LP have been recreated here on disc 2. This takes the new master of from disc 1 essentially and reconforms each track to the original soundtrack edit. So that meant that they had to actually sit there and match the track and edit it and cut it by hand, track by track, which is real dedication and extremely appreciated. My only qualm is that I wish there was a disc 3 that had the original 1973 mix as well, and a disc 4 with the quad mix. But of course, I'm sure both of those would be a lot more licensing hassles. And as I said before, that's why they couldn't include the full quad mix. But I'm just still shocked and amazed that they actually did take the time to actually not only include, but include by recreating the entire original 1973 soundtrack program with the unique soundtrack edits of the original soundtrack release here with the new master, so you can hear the original tracks you may have grown up with and are used to in those edits conformed to, or I should say the new master conformed to those edits. So that program runs 32 minutes 14 seconds, and then we have the bonus materials under additional music. This has several demos, of course, of Sam Monique, sections of the boat chase in early versions, and then we also have extended album track versions of, say, the Sacrifice cue. But key here is some of the material from the exclusive parts of the quadraphonic mix, especially the performance of Live and Let Die, which is an entirely alternate vocal take by B.J. Arnault and is really striking when you hear it for the first time, because we all have the really great cover that's on the soundtrack and heard in the film burned in our heads, but this, again, is an entirely alternate version. And I think I'm guessing it must have been done because of having to better suit the quadraphonic mix or something, maybe. I don't know. Or maybe it's just another version they had done and just marked it as number 2 or something. But that is included here. So the quadraphonic materials here in the additional music section are, of course, carefully folded to stereo because quad was meant to be able to collapse to stereo without a problem. So we now have a physical media representation of some of the quad mix materials for the first time since the very rare and obscure quadraphonic 8-track release. And again, the quad master was scanned and restored in high resolution, I think 24:192 in terms of the overall resolution. So if it ever gets cleared at some point, we could actually see a release of the full quad mix of the album. So the additional music is about 14 minutes, bringing the total of disc 2 to about 46 minutes, and then the overall runtime of both discs is about an hour and 41 minutes. Now, to talk about the packaging and overall design of the release, this, of course, has the original soundtrack cover. It looks very similar to the 2003 CD, so it's very easy to confuse them if you're just looking at stock images online. The difference is they've added a sort of reflective banner. I don't know how clear this is, but you'll see it's a sort of like gold trim around the artwork. Octopussy has the same, so that plus the limited edition moniker and the inside the jewel case, that's how you tell them apart on the front. And of course, the back has unique materials, the LaLa Land, and then a new MGM logo. We open to see beautiful bold orange disc labels with the original typeface, and of course the eye is the dagger, and then just the standard opening jewel case for disc 2 with matching label. Beautifully reproduced imagery and original promotional photos from the film. Inside, we have a lovely essay by the great Jon Burlingame. This is basically a slightly expanded and tweaked version of his write-up for the chapter in his book, The Music of James Bond. This is the essential tome on the Bond scores and the history of the Bond scores. So essentially what they did was take his chapter on Live and Let Die and tweak it a little bit to be repurposed here in this booklet. So if you haven't gotten his essential book, you can actually read his write-up on Live and Let Die here. And they did a similar thing for Octopussy as well. So this is really the best person you could get to talk about any of the Bond scores, since he literally wrote the book on them. And so it's nicely laid out with great imagery. It's nicely printed. The actual paper stock is nice and glossy. And then we have the credits for the overall release. We see all of the great names, and some of which I have mentioned, but in particular, Neil Bulk and Chris Malone, who were, of course, very wonderful and kind enough to answer some of my really geeky, nerdy questions and emails. So it's really wonderful when you can not only gush glowingly about how great a release is and how much you're stunned by it, but also when you can actually get in touch with some of the people responsible and ask them a bunch of geeky questions, and they're happy to actually answer your geeky questions, and that very rarely happens for me. So it was just fantastic that I was able to get in touch with them, and they were kind enough to we had some email conversations, and Chris Malone and I talk about scores and Bond related items and things and film mixes on Twitter and other social media platforms. So it's great that you can actually interact with people. And so if you're into any of this stuff, I would suggest looking both of them up if you're ever curious about any particular technical aspects of some of these releases that they produce. So this is done in the same excellent style as the other LaLa Land Bond releases, and pretty much most of their others, and what you really expect from one of the great boutique soundtrack labels. So you definitely get your money's worth in terms of the overall packaging and artwork and booklet as well. If I did have one slight criticism about the booklet, it's that it doesn't include any transfer notes, and I would like to have seen that in there. Of course, thanks to various online forums and posts and things, you can find out the general information. And also, Neil S. Bulk has done some really great podcast interviews, which I'll include in the links below for further information, where he talks a bit more about the actual technical side and production and what the source was for the Live and Let Die and Octopussy scores in particular. So you can find out the general information, but I wish there had been at least a little about the transfer blurb in the booklet. But that may have been also because the actual piece by Jon Burlingame is an entire chapter of his book basically squeezed into the booklet. So it basically takes up the entirety of the booklet. So there's that too as well. But I just wish there had been a little about the transfer blurb somewhere at the end of the booklet. But that's a very minor thing, because of course you can find out the information online, and I'll link to some of those interviews and forum posts in the description below. But that's the only thing I can think of in terms of a little note or something that I would have done slightly differently. It's just that is literally the only thing I could think of, because this release is so stupendous, just like all the other La La Land releases of Bond scores. I think they are without question, the finest James Bond physical media releases since the 2003 CDs. And by physical media, I mean all of physical media, because unfortunately the releases of the films and their preservation, especially in the audio of the original films, is a hot mess. And to briefly mention, if you want the best audio of not just the score of Live and Let Die, but the actual film mix, you need this guy right behind me, the 1993 MGM Letterbox Laserdisc reissue pressing, which is the best release of the film on the Laserdisc format. Actually, Letterbox fixes the unfortunate pressing defects of the first version, so you have to actually track down and find this version, which you can always distinguish because it has the black, slightly different font for Roger Moore as James Bond 007 here in the corner, and this fixes some of the audio defects on the original pressing. This is without question the best presentation of the film's original mono mix. It wipes the floor with all other versions and shows just how bad the mono options on the modern releases are, if they even have them, because most do not, and shows how bad the Mikasa Studios 5.1 remixes of the film. The only interesting thing about that mix is it does seem to try and recreate the sort of quad mix feel of the title song in the title sequence. So that's okay at least, but the rest of the track is absolutely atrocious with how they messed around with the sound field, and it is vastly inferior to the original mono mix. And the mono lossy presentation on modern releases, again, only American Blu-rays have them. The foreign release Blu-rays do not. But those sound that lossy track sounds woefully inferior to the Laserdisc. So this is still the best sounding release of the film by far, and the only one you should be listening to. But it also has an isolated music and effects track on the analog track, and that's what got goofed up on the first pressing. So if you want to hear an isolated music and effects track of one of the James Bond films, several of the Laserdisc releases do actually have those. Unfortunately, none of this stuff was ported over to even the DVDs and, of course, the Blu-rays as well. So there is still Laserdisc exclusive material in the form of isolated M&E tracks. And before this amazing new La La Land release, the only way you could hear some of the little scraps of the score that were not on the 2003 CD were, in fact, this isolated analog music and effects track. So if you're a diehard Bond fan and a diehard fan of Live and Let Die, as you should be, in order to have absolutely everything, you have to have the, of course, the new La La Land CD. I think it's still nice to have the 2003 CD, which the La La Land is a very worthy successor to. I think it's important to have the original 1973 LP for the amazing gatefold that's laminated and the really wonderful exclusive mix of the original soundtrack, plus having the experience of the original soundtrack program on the original release. In terms of the film, you of course need the Blu-ray, but for the best audio, you need the Laserdisc, which also has the isolated music and effects track. And then, of course, it would be nice one day to have an official release of the quad mix of the soundtrack, but at least you can hear that on YouTube, and some of the unique materials of that have now been restored and included in the supplements on the La La Land release. So in short, I think that this new La La Land release is absolutely stunning. It is a must purchase for any James Bond fan, even if you have the 2003 CD and you know it's the same transfer files that were being utilized once again. It's still essential because the quality difference, the difference in the mixing and the mastering is such that it sounds like a completely new transfer. You will hear elements in the score you've simply never heard before to this degree. Plus, it has the recreation of the original soundtrack program and the bonus cues, and on top of that, even some of the unique elements of the original 1973 quadraphonic 8-track release. So it is a fully comprehensive release. It is a worthy successor to the 2003 CD, and an outstanding release from La La Land and everyone involved. It is one of the great soundtrack releases. It's been one of the great surprise treats for Bond fans to get this and Octopussy out. One can only hope that they will get to tackle more of the series, because they are doing the sort of care and archival research and restoration work that the films have never gotten. So these are, again, they are the best physical media releases of any James Bond material since the 2003 Capitol Expanded Remaster CDs, which I think speaks volumes. This is the kind of care that Eon needs to put into the films with actually restoring them properly and releasing the 4K masters they've been sitting on for really since like 2012 or so. This is a dream type release for Bond fans. This is the type of stuff I thought we'd never see. I thought La La Land would never get to do anything outside of the Brosnan era. I thought we would be lucky if we could get Michael Kamen's License to Kill score, which was beautifully recorded but terribly sequenced on the original release we're still stuck with. So the fact that they were actually able to even go into the Roger Moore era and do 2 titles is astounding. So one can only hope that MGM and Eon will let them continue, because they are doing the absolute best work in terms of preserving elements of the James Bond film series. This is another outstanding must-own soundtrack release. It's one of the great releases from a boutique label. Yes, they can be, in terms of the releases, they can be a little bit on the pricey side, but they are definitely worth every single penny. You can really tell attention to detail and extreme care went into this release with every single track cue. And the difference between just comparing this to the 2003 expanded remaster, which itself was already great, but just comparing those two is astonishing, the level of quality difference. And it's coming from the same files, which is just still, again, I don't know what sonic wizardry that Chris Malone was able to do, but it's sonic wizardry. It's that type of improvement. It's just astonishing. So this is... It's one of my favorite soundtrack releases of all time. It is my favorite film, and to see its score finally get deluxe treatment even beyond the expanded 2003 CD is just, again, it's a pipe dream I've had for years. I never thought it would happen. I never thought the score would get released again. I thought we'd get lucky if we got the 4 Brosnan era scores on expanded remasters, and they've now gotten to do 3 of those. So again, we're just hoping that the MGM floodgates will open and Eon will say, okay, yes, you can go restore the scores we haven't been paying attention to. And so hopefully maybe we could get to the entire original 20 film series, and even the scores like The Spy Who Loved Me and Dr. No that don't have an official release of the actual film score. So this is truly important work being done. It should be championed and supported by all Bond fans, even if you're not into soundtrack collecting. These releases are so amazingly well done, and done with such care and such attention to detail that they are really the absolute pinnacle of James Bond and physical media releases of any kind, of any format. So this gets my absolute highest recommendation. It is certainly worth its weight in gold, and don't let the slightly higher pricing point of a boutique soundtrack release, or if you have the 2003 release, thinking that you're okay sticking with that, don't let those deter you, because this is truly worth every penny, and it manages to outdo and best the 2003 expanded remaster at every turn, which I didn't expect that either, especially. So this is an outstanding release. Please go check out the La La Land website. If you're curious about this, order directly from them. Help support their boutique label and the wonderful releases they do all throughout the year. And here's hoping, if the sales are strong enough, which I know they're bound to be, maybe this will convince the powers that be at MGM and Eon to say, oh, well, okay, you guys can do the rest of them. Okay, yeah, we're busy looking at other things. So that's the hope, fingers crossed. But until then, both this and Octopussy are just the surprises of the decade for us Bond fans who are starving for Bond material. And just never thought the original films were going to get much attention or any sort of restoration or preservation efforts. And this is a dream release for all Bond fans. It is that good, that amazing, that well done, and done with such care that one can only hope that the same team can tackle the rest of the scores. So as always, please do keep supporting independent and boutique labels in terms of soundtrack releases wherever possible. They really do such incredible work and have to really deal with the ever-changing music industry and the expense of licensing and the difficulties of dealing with studios and rights holders. And they do the absolute best with what they have access to and the best that they can in all areas. And they really do the work that you wish other labels on the video side of things, or studios in particular, would do. But they really do such a fantastic job on all the La La Land releases that I've listened to, and in particular these Bond ones are near and dear to my heart because Bond, of course, is my life's obsession. If you've not seen my channel before, but it's just something I never thought would happen. I think all of us Bond fans thought the scores were going to be locked to the 2003 Capitol remasters, and that was it. So let's just hope more can come down the pipeline if MGM and Eon will okay it. But anyway, by supporting these releases, you ensure La La Land and other labels are able to continue their great work in terms of helping to keep both the art of film scoring alive, but also physical media in terms of soundtrack releases alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.